In this time of Lent, we're supposed to imagine that we're in the desert with Jesus. I think most of the time when we think about that, we think about Jesus in the desert under a hot, scorching sun, because that's what we think of when we think of deserts. But today, I'd like us to consider what it was like for Jesus at night. At night, Jesus would go to sleep, probably trying to find some sort of soft spot in the sand. And since he was fasting for days and days on end, it's pretty certain that he would wake up. And he may have just woken up in the middle of the night to do his prayers. And when he woke up, he would have looked up, and on a cloudless night, he would have seen glory, right? The glory of the stars above. This is 2,000 years ago. There are no satellites in the sky. There's no light pollution. There's very little air pollution. So imagine the last time you saw the Milky Way clearly and then up it a few notches. He would have seen a crystal clear, glorious sky with the Milky Way spread out above him, with stars everywhere. But what did those stars mean to someone 2,000 years ago? Back then, they understood the universe differently than we do now. We think of the universe just stretching out millions and billions of light years in every direction. That's what science has taught us. That hasn't happened yet 2,000 years ago. They believe that the stars are like a sphere that surrounds the earth and just turns around it, and that the stars are sort of stuck onto this sphere, just like in children's bedrooms, often we'll put glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, so when they go to bed, they look up and they see stars above them. That's what they thought real stars were, just stars stuck on a dark sphere that circled around the earth. Now, there were shooting stars, of course, momentary glimpses of movement in the sky, but most of the movement that happened in the sky came from planets, right? And back then, if you were, say, a Greek or a Roman, looking up into the night sky, looking at Mars or Venus or Jupiter, you wouldn't think of those as rocks with atmospheres around them. Instead, they were gods. Those glowing lights in the sky which moved each night, they were gods in the sky. So Mars was the god of war. That's where we get the month of March from. That's where its name comes from. Mars was the god of war who would decide whether battles were won or lost down on earth. Venus was the goddess of love and desire. People would pray to Venus if they wanted to get pregnant or to have someone fall in love with them. Jupiter was the king of the gods. Mercury was the messenger god. And these gods were known through Greek and Roman myths for being a really rambunctious, immoral lot. They liked to have sex with each other and sex with humans. They would rape humans. They would come down and make all sorts of trouble on earth in ways which were deeply unpredictable. And this made a difference. For your Romans and Greeks, nature was something that was very hard to predict. If suddenly a volcano erupted or an earthquake happened or a famine broke out, this was because the gods were upset. Well, what were they upset about? That was often hard to know. So pagans made a lot of sacrifices. They were constantly sacrificing to the gods, asking for protection from misfortune, because you didn't want to get on the wrong side of a god. That's how the pagans saw the world, as deeply, deeply unpredictable and chaotic. But for Jesus, sitting in the desert, looking up at the sky, he had a different view, because he was a Jew. And the Jews, when they looked up into the night sky, didn't see chaos. They saw order. They didn't believe that Mars and Venus and Jupiter and Mercury and Saturn were gods. Those are simply lights in the sky which God was in charge of. There was only one God who had made a world that worked, a universe that made sense. And we hear that in Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, right? The heavens, night and day, are ordered. Things happen in a regular way, and they speak wordlessly to the ends of the earth of a mysterious order and coherence to the universe, which we human beings don't understand, but exists just the same. And the psalm goes from the realm of the heavens down to the sun, and here the tenor of the poem shifts slightly, becomes a little less mysterious. The sun is described as being like a bridegroom coming out of his pavilion on his wedding day. This is the best day in the bridegroom's life, as far as Jews are concerned. He comes out dressed in beautiful clothes, looking forward to this wonderful day. And then the psalm says, the sun is like an athlete, rejoicing as he runs the race across the sky, bringing warmth to all the world. The psalm is saying that the stars and the sun live in a world of order, and they are happy with their place in it. They are happy to follow their courses across the sky for the benefit of others below. This sounds poetic to us. Doesn't sound the least bit scientific. How can the sun be happy? How can the stars speak? Makes no sense to us. But this vision of an orderly universe is actually the foundation of our scientific perspective. In the 17th century, when Isaac Newton came up with the laws of physics as we understand them, the law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity, he was deeply, deeply steeped in the Bible. He read the Hebrew scriptures in the original Hebrew. He could read the New Testament in Greek. He left reams and reams of religious writings which weren't published until after his death. For him, the regularity of the skies, as promised by the Bible, led him to believe that the laws of physics had been created by God to create an orderly universe that we could live in without worrying that life was fundamentally chaotic and incomprehensible. He chose the word law when he wanted to describe how nature works, because he wanted to emphasize there are rules and you can count on them. So our scientific perspective, which now disavows God and just says that's just the way it works, it started with a deeply religious conviction inspired by texts like this. This is where physics starts. Now, the psalm goes further than Newton did, because although it talks about the order in the skies, it then moves on to human beings. And it talks about how human beings should rejoice when they follow the moral instructions that God has given us. And the language which is used in this psalm is curious. It says that the moral instructions which God has given us are worth more than gold. They're sweeter than honey. They are radiant. Gold, honey, radiant. All these metaphors come from the sun. Gold is yellow, so is honey. We've been told that the sun rejoices in its radiance early on. So the psalm is making an explicit link that just as the stars and the sun are happy to do their duty for God up in the sky, we too should be happy down here to follow the moral instructions which God has given us. Now, that is a weird idea by modern standards. When you go to university and you study astronomy, you don't have to go to philosophy class, right? When you go to philosophy class, you don't have to study astronomy. These are two completely different departments. They have nothing to do with each other. The laws which govern the stars have nothing to do with whether you should, fool around or not fool around, steal or not steal. It's got nothing to do with that. So what is the psalm talking about? The psalm is suggesting that there is a principle which guides both the stars and human behavior, and that is that there is liberty through limits. The sun can't just go anywhere it wants in the sky. It follows a particular track. Human beings the psalmist suggesting, shouldn't expect to have a happy life if they can just do anything they want, but rather that there's limits. And through those limits, we will be happy. Seems like a strange idea, but where it comes from is that in the Bible there's this sense that when God created the world, each of the major elements would have gone too far had God not established some sort of limit on it. So for instance, when God speaks to Job in the book of Job, and he describes what it was like when God created the universe, God said this to the seas. And we have a slide for this. God said this to the seas, "This far you may come, but no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt." So the sea's not allowed to run over the land. It has to stop at the shore. God has created a universe where the sun can't get too hot, and the winter can't stay too long, and the summer can't stay too long. God has created a world where everything has limits and is expected to live within limits for the good of that particular element and the harmony of the whole overall. And this psalm is suggesting that that is true of us too. Now, in the Bible, the obvious limit to our behavior is the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's spouse. Those limits sound difficult and old-fashioned to us, but it's partially because we don't hear them the way they were originally composed. In the Hebrew, the word commandment, the word that we translate as commandment, is mitzvah, like bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. And a mitzvah is meant to be good advice that you're invited to take for your own good and for the good of the whole. So a modern example of a mitzvah is don't run a red light in your car. That's a mitzvah because it's to your benefit and to the benefit of all the other drivers. Wear your seatbelt. That's a mitzvah. Because if you wear your seatbelt, you're not going to go flying through your windscreen during an accident, which is what used to happen. And that was no good for anybody. It's certainly not good for the person who went through the windscreen. It's not good for the people who had to walk by the scene of the person who went through the windscreen. Not good for the EMS people who came to find you on the ground. Wear your seatbelt. It's a good idea. Except apparently in Hollywood movies where nobody wears their seatbelts. I don't know. I guess they're immortal. Mitzvahs are good advice which are in your interest to take. Now, in our day and age, though, we don't want to hear anybody telling us what to do. And that's one of the reasons why churches empty out, right? Because no one wants to listen to church authority. But there's a paradox of how things have gone in modern society as we have removed more and more limits. Take a look at the dating scene, for instance. I think that historically, we could say, truthfully, that it's never been easier to have a date than now. Tinder, Grindr, Bumble, they all make it really, really easy to find someone to sleep with or have a date with, right? Like, it used to be, back in the day, dating myself here, you had to pray that you might meet someone interesting at work or at school or maybe at a party. Oh, please, I'd really like to have a partner. Could someone cross my path who's compatible? Now, swipe, 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 yes. Swipe, 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 yes. Right? It's easy. I mean, you could go out on several dates a week, whereas before, you might wait 6 months before you met anybody who was half decent for a date. And yet, the paradox is that statistically, people in their 20s and 30s now have sex less often than people did a generation ago, and they're in fewer serious relationships. We have all the liberty in the world to date, but fewer people are dating. All the liberty in the world to meet strangers to have sex, but fewer people are having sex in that age group. Another example from the United States, gun laws. In most states in the US, it's pretty easy to buy a handgun. And most people buy handguns for self-defense. And yet, we see in the newspapers over and over again that removing the limit to buying handguns has resulted in disaster. The mass shootings show that more liberty with gun purchases does not translate into more liberty for individuals. Instead, school children, people going to the mall, people at concerts are suddenly at risk of being shot dead by complete strangers who are having a bad day. But as much as the headlines tell us that the real problem with guns is mass shootings, it's not actually how most people die in the United States through gun-related violence. That's not it. People buy guns for self-defense, but the majority of people who die from guns die through suicide. 54% of all gun deaths in the United States in 2022 were from suicide. So you bought the gun to protect yourself, and yet the result was you completely lost your own personal liberty. By removing the limits on who can buy a gun, people's liberty has not been enhanced, but destroyed. One more example, theft. Toronto is currently in the midst of an epidemic of car theft, right? It's happening all the time. Car gangs are having a field day, stealing cars left, right, and center. It would seem as though we've suddenly just become more dishonest and there's just more bad actors there stealing cars. But that's not actually what's going on. Even Toronto police admit that the reason this is happening, the reason we're getting such a spike, is because car manufacturers change the way cars work. I don't know if it was considered really a hardship, but they gave us the liberty not to use keys, right? Our cars now work with fobs. You walk up to your car, boop, boop, and you open it up, you get in, and a lot of new cars they have keyless ignitions. So you don't have to use a key to get it started. You can put your fob back in your pocket as you walk up to the car and just push a button. I guess that was really cool when it came out. I remember when it came out going, wow, that's really cool. And it's more liberty, I guess. But the net result has been that it's a cinch for car thieves to just buy some fancy tech, and they can just walk up to your car, push a few buttons, and walk into your car and drive away, because they can hack your car. They hack your fob, and they hack your car, and they can just drive away in seconds. It's simple now. More liberty has not resulted in more liberty. Instead, removing the limits has made for a retraction of liberty. In the modern world, we're unlikely to all say, hey, let's go back to church and obey all those limits. That's not how this is going to play out. But in Lent, we are encouraged to adopt some limits voluntarily so that we can get a sense of when you limit yourself, paradoxically, you can actually feel greater liberty to be who you are by choosing who you are. Am I a person who lives entirely according to impulse, or am I going to choose the principles on which I live and fulfill those, even if it means I don't do some of the things I used to do? That's not a popular choice in modern society, but as we can see, society's kind of unraveling as it tries to just exercise liberty in every possible way. And so we, Christians, are invited to be like Jesus in the desert, under the night sky, seeing a sky full of stars, which we know do operate according to a divine order. Newton wasn't wrong about the natural laws which pertain in the sky. And we are invited, like Jesus, to be part of that order, even if it means imposing some order on ourselves. And when we do, we know, through the witness of the Bible, that God is waiting for us, saying, thank you for choosing order. This is going to work out better for you and for everybody else around you. And our proof in this, one last paradox, because this is just full of paradoxes, is that Jesus, when he was sitting on a rock looking at the sky, thinking about what the future might bring for him, contemplating the ultimate limit to his freedom, being pinned to a cross, he was promised that if you adopt that limit, a love which is limitless will appear on earth and propagate through your followers for thousands of years. And we are all the heirs to that promise, a promise of liberty through limits.